Hello, this is a roundtable on geopolitics and history of Ukraine, which is being recorded for the Durham Book Festival. My name is Markian Prokopovych. I'm a historian and I work at Durham University on different aspects of Central and Eastern Europe in the modern period, and I will be chairing this discussion. This event is the first one at Durham this academic year in a whole series of events we've put together with a new partner, Zaporizhzhia National University in Ukraine. And these will be events on various aspects of Ukraine's past and present, which may be of interest to the general public. So watch out our university website and our social media for further information about the upcoming events this autumn and also in early 2023. Now, we are particularly keen to offer voice to our colleagues in Zaporizhzhia because the city, as those who watch the news surely know, is one of those that's being the most viciously bombarded right now by the Russian forces. Today's event is dedicated to the discussion of the place of the current ongoing war in broader European and global politics, as well as the place of history and historians. Many of us are historians present here in that broader conflict. Our esteemed guests are Stanislav Cherkasov, who is an associate professor at Zaporizhzhia National University and an expert in the history of Eastern, Central, and Southeastern Europe, with a broad range of interests from early modern Poland to contemporary foreign policy, international relations, and the role of mass media in the ongoing information war. Olesya Khromeychuk, who's the director of the Ukrainian Institute in London, a historian herself and an author, the author of many works on Ukrainian history, in particular Undetermined Ukrainians, Post-War Narratives of the Waffen-SS Galicia Division, Peter Lang, 2013, and A Loss, the history of a dead soldier told by his sister, 2021, the latter being a reflection by Olesya as a historian and as a person of the story of her brother who was killed while serving in the Ukrainian army in the Donbass in 2017. And finally, Olena Palko, who's an assistant professor at Basel University in Switzerland, also an author of many works on Ukrainian history and culture, in particular, Making Ukraine Soviet, Literature and Cultural Politics under Lenin and Stalin, Bloomsbury 2020. So I wanted to begin by thanking all three participants, all three panelists for agreeing to participate in this event at a time that's really very difficult and stressful to most Ukrainians. So the way we would like to do this is Stanislav has prepared a sort of a more formal short statement, which we will ask him to read out at the right now, and then we'll take it from there. I'll ask for questions or perhaps comments from Olesya and Olena, and we will continue with further issues that have to do with Ukraine, its broader place in global geopolitics and history. So Stanislav, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for this introduction. I really appreciate being here today, and good evening to all of you, because we have evening here in Ukraine. Well, my name is Stan Cherkasov, as was already mentioned. I am an associate professor of world history and international relations at the Parisian National University in Ukraine. And As far as I understand, I was supposed to talk on the topic of our event. And I have prepared some references, some introductions. So first of all, coming back to the original question, so about Russia's invasion to Ukraine, I would like to mention that Russia's invasion to Ukraine constitutes the biggest threat to peace and security in Europe since the end of the Cold War. It's obvious that Ukraine has long played an important, yet sometimes overlooked role in the global security order. And today the country is on the front lines of a renewed great power rivalry that many experts say will dominate international relations in the decades ahead. Ukraine became a battleground in 2014, as far as it's known, when Russia annexed Crimea and invaded the Donbas region in the country's southeast. The past 3 decades, and especially the year since the 2014, which is called Revolution of Dignity, Russian annexation of Crimea and intervention in Donbas have witnessed a significant consolidation of Ukrainian civic identity. A generation has grown up in an independent Ukraine that, for all its flaws, has maintained a true democracy and is becoming increasingly European in its outlook. If anything, the current war has further united Ukrainian citizens from all regions and linguistic and religious backgrounds, while reinforcing the split between Ukrainian and Russian identities. Thus, whatever happens on the battlefield, Russia is almost certain to fail in its bid to establish lasting control over its neighbor. The war against Ukraine proves that Europe is even more in danger than Europeans thought just a few months ago. And Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine is not only an unprovoked attack on a sovereign country standing up for its rights and democracy, but it is also the biggest challenge to Europe's security order since the end of the World War II. At stake are the very principles upon which international relations are built, not least those of the UN Charter and the Helsinki Final Act. Scientists, researchers are convinced that European Union must be more than a soft power. It needs hard power too. However, it needs to realize that the concept of hard power cannot be reduced to military means. It is about using the full range of instruments to achieve vital goals. It is about thinking and acting in terms of power, and bit by bit, the conditions for this to happen are being fulfilled. Historians should acknowledge that in the history of European defense, there have been numerous plans and initiatives full of acronyms going from the Pleven Plan and the European Defense Community. Yet the basic fact remains that security and defense is probably the area in European Union integration with the biggest gap between expectations and results. Yet there is a growing awareness among Europeans about the threats they face together and the degree to which their fates are tied. Today, no one in Europe can believe or think that what is happening in Ukraine does not concern them, no matter how far away they are from the drama. Crises tend to crystallize developments, and this one has made it even clearer that we live in a world shaped by raw power politics, where everything is weaponized and where we face a fierce battle of narratives, battles of memories, concepts, witnessing nowadays the true clash of civilizations. Yeah? And all these trends were already happening before the Ukraine war. Now they are accelerating. In a nuclear-armed world, their direct superpower conflict can have apocalyptic consequences. The proxy battlefield has become economics and finance. The Western civilization response to Russia's invasion has relied on tools that combine its soft power in the form of brands, companies, and markets with more military mechanisms. At its core, war is about power. Who has it? Who doesn't, and who can effectively apply it. The war in Ukraine is no exception, but the outcomes over the first month of the war have surprised many observers challenging some traditional assessments of military and economic power. Most unexpected has been that Russia's military advantages did not allow it to accomplish its initial objectives. Instead, Ukrainian forces have held their own and even pushed the Russian military back in places. At least a part of the explanation lies in some changes in the nature and exercise of power that have emerged over the past decade. The war in Ukraine is justified by the Kremlin with the rhetoric of the mid-19th or even 18th century. Wherever the Russian imperial flag has ever been raised once should remain the Russian territory forever. Poland, for instance, was also under Russian imperialism. Similar colonial aspects have been defined. This contrast accounts of the 19th century imperialism by Mackinder, the economist John Hobson. Mackinder and Hobson might be taken as paradigmatic ideologies at two ends of discussion, but in many respects they share similar concerns. Both gave university extension lectures to develop secondary academic disciplines. For Mackinder, it was geography. For Hobson, it was a style of economics that was at once historical, sociological, and institutional. The challenge is that people in Russia have experienced decades of brainwashing about the so-called evils of the West. Many Russians don't care about politics at all. They don't care about international relations. They don't question the news they watch. The important point in the understanding of Russian nationalism is that the post-1991 Russian Federation is a fragment of the empire rather than a nation state. Russian political and media establishment rejects the very possibility of critically assessing the Russian cultural legacy. This is where scientists can really help. So scholars, researchers in history, psychology, communications, conflict management, and negotiations study how to influence someone who has strong incentives to maintain their beliefs. We can craft clearer, less threatening, more persuasive messages. So people who are trying to break through the wall of Russian propaganda, from concerned activists to the US government, would be wise to tap into this wealth of research-driven expertise. When faced with false and dangerous beliefs, our initial impulse is to make the strongest, most attention-grabbing argument possible. So offering concrete action steps such as accessing independent use is key to motivating action. These messages also explain in few words how to access websites and browsers that evade government censorship and internet blogs and provide reliable information on what is really happening in the war. In this way, we combined our very different skills to reach Russians with messages that we hope will leave them more open to hearing the truth about the war their country is waging. So we hope others join us in paving this path toward peace. A final example of the blurred line between hard and soft power has been the rise of thousands of so-called hacktivists who are engaging in an online campaign to hack Russian websites and combat Russian disinformation. These groups have been using cyber capabilities, a hard power tool, to seize Russian data and hold it hostage, to collect and release internal Russian government communications, and to break through Russia's internet blockade to communicate with its citizens. These activities have both operational goals: to undermine Russian capabilities and goals of persuasion, to break Russian popular support for the war. As Russia's invasion of Ukraine has stalled and its forces have invaded the battleground in the east, the war is entering a new, darker, and more dangerous phase. Ruined cities provide a preview of that future. So Putin, who bombed the Ukrainian cities, as well bombed Russian cities. For example, we can remember the Grozny campaign in Chechnya. And certainly he has no moral reservations about mass destruction. Crimes against humanity are certain acts that are purposefully committed by Russia or on behalf of Russia as a part of a widespread or systematic policy typically directed against civilians. Moreover, the war in Ukraine is now unambiguously Putin's war, and the Russian leader knows that he cannot lose without risking his regime and even perhaps his life. Some scientists argue that the world has re-entered a Cold War period dominated by bipolarity and competition between autocracy and democracy. But the greater diversity of actors exercising power, the more extensive interdependence and the proliferation of tools that combine hard and soft power suggest otherwise. Instead, the world seems to be moving to an environment that is hyper-competitive, but in which power is more diffuse, dynamic, and cross-cutting than was the case during the Cold War. This may lead to increasing international instability and conflict, and it certainly creates an array of new challenges for states. But it also creates new opportunities, especially for smaller states pushing back on larger ones and for non-state actors seeking influence. To achieve the upper hand, policymakers will need to account for and coordinate the many non-state actors as well. Researchers and policymakers need to stop watching the war in Ukraine like, a football match and placing bets on who will win. This is a war for the survival of Europe. This is a battle for the values of mankind, for European values, for human rights, for European cultural identity, for human dignity. Who will become the next victim of Russian aggression if Ukraine falls? So Europeans may have now second chance to support Ukraine. On February the 24th, 2022, Russia forever changed the way we perceive politics and military operations in mainland Europe by launching an invasion of Ukraine, an invasion that made millions of Ukrainians seek refuge in Western countries, evolved into the most terrifying political, financial, and humanitarian crisis in modern history. But the determined resistance of the Ukrainian people to Russian aggression has shown the fall of Putin's vision of reality. Despite Russia's superior military might, the Ukrainian people have made a stand for their sovereignty and their freedom. Stand with Ukraine. Thank you for attention.
Stand with Ukraine, Slava Ukraini. Thank you very much, Stanislav. I have to say, I'm always impressed to see a historian not only just drawing, conclusions from the historical development, but actually drawing some suggestions about, contemporary policy and what all of us could actually do. There's been a lot of interesting points here, I thought, from, Ukraine and what's happening in Ukraine now, what that means to the change of the current world order, to the role of media as soft power, to Huntington's much criticized clash of civilizations, to imperialism, to the need to recognize what Russia is doing as crimes against humanity, and so on and so forth. Can I open the floor for comments and questions, please? Olesya, Olena.
Thank you. Shall I begin?
Yes, please.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Stanislav, for that statement. Of course, I agree with it entirely. There's only one moment on which I suppose I don't share your enthusiasm fully, and that's when you say that no one in Europe can believe or think that what is happening in Ukraine does not concern them. I live in Western Europe, and I wish I would say that there aren't people who don't think that this is not their war anymore. I think there's still a lot of people like that, and I also think that Putin has very successfully, or the Kremlin and Russia, the leadership, have successfully encouraged people to focus on domestic issues such as cost of living and energy bills without realizing that the source of their trouble is essentially also in the Kremlin. So yeah, but we can talk about that. I'll offer a couple of observations which hopefully will complement what you said, but maybe more from a historical point of view, especially with the sort of work that I've been doing recently. And that's, first of all, when we think about Russia and Russia's perception of Ukraine, there's this imperialist inability to see Ukrainians as people with subjectivity, with a very clear sense of self. Yeah, an inability each time, whichever period in history we look at, there's this profound mistake of misjudging Ukrainians as the people who will stand up for themselves and who will protect themselves. And I think this blindness comes from an imperialist worldview. Now, the really sad thing about it is that much of the rest of the world has perceived Ukrainians in the same way until 7 months ago. And so the perception that was formed about Ukraine was formed through the eyes of Moscow. And I think this is particularly true about those cultures that are themselves formerly imperialist cultures. I think for former imperial centers, it's always easier to understand another imperial center and not to trust the subaltern. And that was the sad reality on the 24th of February, when it was very clear that Ukrainians are not trusted with their own fate, with their own defiance, with their own resilience. And suddenly the world was surprised to see how resilient they were. And it was great to see that admiration. But to me, it also signaled just how profoundly misunderstood Ukraine was. And so one of the reasons, I think, if we think about geopolitics, but also if we put it in historical context, the reason for that is that, and I'll focus on Europe here, is that so-called old Europe, let's stick to perhaps Western Europe, in that Europe's imagination, Ukraine has not really been much more than a buffer zone. Right. And the buffer zone, it's very easy when a buffer zone becomes a battle zone, a war zone, right? You just kind of accept it as well. That's what happens in buffer zones. And even if we look at the last 100 years, just over 100 years, so if we look at the period immediately after the First World War, something that in the West is known as Russian Civil War. Very few people in the West know that there was a Ukrainian Revolution at this time. And Olena, I will not be covering this period. This is totally area of your expertise. But I just wanted to say that, this was the period that for the first time, Ukrainians did not just, develop a clear sense of self and sense of Ukrainian identity, but actually created Ukrainian polity. Lands came together into a state. Okay, the state didn't last very long, and that we can see it as a failure or maybe not, depending on what the aims of the leadership at the time were. But that experience shaped the imagination of Ukrainians as not just a people, a nation, but a nation that can have its own state. And within that state, all territories, all lands can be incorporated. And that idea continues to be extremely influential. And when people talk about divisions in Ukraine, we can discuss that later, to me, what is surprising is that in spite of the empires trying their very best to create as many divisions in Ukraine as possible, and essentially groups of Ukrainians living in different empires, and therefore it's only natural for them to develop their identities differently. In spite of all of that, there's been a hunger, even over 100 years ago, to come together as a political nation, to be together within the same polity. And that is something that I think has been misunderstood over 100 years ago, continues to be misunderstood now. And that's also because Ukraine is perceived as a buffer zone. At the time, I'd like to hear what you think, Olena, but my view is that, Ukraine was sacrificed essentially for the sake of stronger Poland, right? So there is a stronger state that can stand between Europe proper and the Red Thread and the Bolsheviks, right? And so Ukraine fell through the cracks of this of this imagination of Europe. And of course, that cost Ukrainians dearly. We can talk about the Holodomor, we can talk about the famine, which claimed millions of lives. We can talk about repressions of the 1930s and so on. And again, none of that received any proper attention. It still doesn't receive the attention it deserves today, because the voices of Ukraine are not treated on the same level as the voices coming out of Moscow. It's changing a little bit, but it hasn't changed entirely yet. The Second World War, we can talk about the same thing, not just buffer zone, but bloodlands, as Timothy Snyder has called it. And I know Markian, you want to come back to the question of the Second World War, so I won't dwell on that. But there are things that we can learn, a lot of things that we can learn from the experience of the Second World War on the territory of Ukraine, which might help us understand what's going on today. And then let's look at the 90s. Ukraine becomes independent, and so you think, well, now finally Ukraine will have a voice, the voice that they can ring on the same level as all the other independent states. But it doesn't. When the so-called kidnapped West is beginning to return to Europe proper, it's been embraced, at least in people's imagination, as part of Europe, Ukraine remains in this sort of blur of post-Soviet space in people's imagination. And that blur means that it doesn't have clear identity on people's mental maps. It's somewhere in the sphere of influence of Russia. Yeah. And so that has a very profound effect on what happens in 2014. And now I'm coming very close to today. In 2014, when Russia occupies Crimea and parts of Donbass, old Europe still perceives it as a kind of, they're still acting within the sphere of influence that they control. And so it wags its finger at Russia and doesn't really do very much. And by not doing very much, by not responding adequately to Russia breaking international law, violating international law, it endorses Putin's moves. It funds the escalation of the war by being dependent, some countries really profoundly dependent on Russian energy resources. And essentially enables the escalation that we saw earlier this year. So this is the kind of soul searching that I would really like to encourage to happen in Western Europe, is to think, well, what role have we played so far in actually facilitating this situation? Because when I hear conversations that, we don't want to get too involved in this war, we don't want to, we don't want to have boots on the ground. And so I understand where those concerns are coming from, but I really want us to sit down and think how we have been involved in this war, because we have been very actively, and by we, I mean Western Europe, that's where I'm based. We have been very actively involved, in particular through inaction, by turning a blind eye, but also through, funding Russia and Russia's escalation. And also begin to think what it means to continue to see Ukraine as a buffer zone, because these calls for concessions, these calls for peace at any cost, not justice, not lasting peace, but peace at any cost, continue to treat Ukraine as a buffer zone. And if that is what Ukraine is going to be pushed towards, especially now when Putin is trying to escalate it even further with the new mobilization wave, again, is something I'd like to talk about in relation to the Second World War. If we continue to treat Ukraine as a buffer zone, then we accept it being a war zone for the foreseeable future. And none of us can afford that. Obviously, Ukrainians will never accept it. They will continue to fight for their sovereignty, but we in Europe will be shooting ourselves in the foot if we accept that situation. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Olesya. Yes, indeed. What is the role of Ukraine? Is it a buffer zone? Is it actually a historical actor in its own right? And what is the role of the West in this whole conflict? Olena, can we ask you for comments?
For your statement, and Olesya, for those points that you raised. I would just perhaps add a little bit of my thoughts on this, and I would also like to comment on the nature of Russian nationalism, perhaps that Stanislav, you so rightly determine as key in the war, that like kind of in understanding the war today. And I would agree that the Russian society has never had an incentive to come to terms with their imperial past. There was always this longing for the golden age, be it the imperial past or the Soviet era. And in the description of this panel, Markian, you also mentioned that there is this attempt to recreate the Soviet empire. Perhaps I would challenge that, saying that we need to think what type of empire, what kind of empire Putin is trying to recreate with this war, whether it's the Soviet or the imperial past. And I would argue that there is a bit of both, and basically there are parts from the Soviet past and parts from the imperial past. And Olesya, you'll be talking more about the Second World War. I think it's a key to understanding Russia today. But this is this golden age and the longing of the Russian society. And Stanislav, you rightly pointed out that Russia is being presented as a nation state, and there is very little appreciation for Russia's multilingual and multi-confessional nature. And it is funny, yes, and ironic that in view of the war today, with this mass mobilization that Olesya mentioned already, we see how disproportionately some representatives of non-Russians are being drafted to the army. And we see the mobilization of ethnicity again. It's kind of unwilling mobilization of ethnicity that hopefully will kind of lead to, will lead to some changes within Russia itself. Hopefully, we'll see where it goes. But it's actually, I think, for the West, this mobilization of ethnicities, these voices of non-Russians within Russia are also important, because because of this narrative of an empire, which Russia never ceased to be an empire, right, or present itself as an empire. We hear the story of Russia through Russian eyes. Even the story of Russia, which is multi-ethnic and multi-confessional. And those voices or those protests, those singular protests sometimes of those non-Russians within Russia are important to show that Russia is something, there is Russia beyond Moscow and St. Petersburg. And another point perhaps I wanted to raise is that what you, Stanislav, said, that we should try to tell the truth about the war. And when I read that, I was thinking whether it's our role actually to tell Russians what the truth about this war is, especially since most in Russia do not want to acknowledge that. And I was thinking about the need to decolonize Soviet and Russian studies. Olesya spoke about it a lot recently. And basically there is this need to write the new imperial history of Russia by defining Russia for what it was. But at the same time, we here, as it happens, we are 4 Ukrainian historians. Is it our task to rewrite the history of Russia? And I think what is our task is actually to tell the story about Ukraine, Olesya, what you were saying already, to kind of provide Ukraine with the voice to write new narratives that would undermine those Russian-centered narratives. And this is what my task as a historian is. I'm working on the interwar period. So Olesya, you referred to me that I know more about the revolutionary period. I know more about the kind of the early Soviet period, the 1920s and early 1930s. And actually, it ties very well together, obviously, because during the Ukrainian Revolution, we have those different Ukrainian governments claiming the right to represent the territory and the people, which encompassed almost the entire territory of today's Ukraine. But at the same time, those attempts were sometimes short-lived, and as Olesya, you rightly pointed out, they were not internationally recognized. And there was this, at the end of the Second World War, we have this hierarchy of self-determinations, when every nation, so to say, has the right for self-determination. But at the same time, there are those countries who are recognized as Poland, and there are those who are not, as Ukraine. And rightly so, like Olesya, you were right by saying that obviously there was like Poland and Romania, and this is why we also have in the interwar period a Greater Romania. They were seen as stronger buffer states against the Red threat, and Ukraine was not seen as such. And this is the history that we basically kind of the legacy that we experienced today. And it was also very important for me to actually look at the 1920s, at the early Soviet Ukraine, and see how those Ukrainian actors, those often Ukrainian communists, how they envisaged Soviet Ukraine from a small s, not the capital S. What Soviet Ukraine was for them, how they were trying to determine those Soviet projects and projects of Sovietization, and how often those projects were going against the Moscow perspective on the role and on the role of Ukraine within the Soviet Union. And perhaps I know that, Markian, you had questions about Sovietization. I will perhaps speak more about that later. But this is what I wanted to say, that I just kind of feel that it's not our role to tell Russians what they should think. Our role is to write the kind of Ukrainian history and try to sort of debunk this meta-narrative that Russia is producing, and kind of the most influential narrative, unfortunately, in the West. And we just need more voices to tell this story, and not only of Ukraine, of other so-called non-Russian peripheries, right? Because this is how we call them, Russia and non-Russian peripheries. But those peripheries are too different just to name them under one kind of umbrella term. And this is kind of the more complex history. The more understanding of this complexity there is, the less truth, so to say, lays with Moscow. Thank you.
Thanks, Olena. Wonderful. Yes, it's actually very interesting how we over and over again come back to the concept of decolonization, which has been so much, discussed for a very different context in the UK and generally in old Europe, thinking about histories of colonialism. I'd like to return to this a bit later, but before we move, before we discuss this, the Second World War has already been mentioned, several times, and it was indeed the Second World War, or the Great Patriotic War, as it is known in Soviet and Russian historiography. Even today, it is significant that there is a different term for it, and different meaning. It was, of course, a very important historical moment, but it's just, the culture and the media is full of references to it. So, I mean, can I ask you, Olesya, first? I mean, do you think, to what extent the events that took place, over 70 years ago, do they even influence the current events and the current war? And if so, in what way? Are we just talking about memories and misinterpretations of the war, or is it more than that?
Thank you for that question. Kind of difficult to answer when you've been involved in that topic for so long to pick the things to focus on. But I guess what I'd like to emphasize is that the history of the Second World War is most important today, in that it's been instrumentalized by Russia for so long. It's been instrumentalized for all sorts of reasons, but specifically to justify occupation of parts of Ukraine in 2014 and the aggression against Ukraine. There's a episode that is described in lots of different articles and books in Konstantinivka, I think, when a group of Russian proxies and local collaborators are trying to start an old Second World War monument, a tank. And they are desperate to start it, to get it going and say that we're going to go and fight the fascists in Ukraine. And of course, it's kind of anecdotal, but it shows you how that kind of instrumentalization of the Second World War, of the history of the Second World War, which, let's emphasize it one more time, is still in Russia, referred to in Russia as the Great Patriotic War. It's important because it does not start, as far as the Russians are concerned, in 1939. It starts in 1941, which means that it misses out the period of collaboration and essentially attacking Western Ukraine and Belarus together with, Poland, attacking Poland together with Hitler. So that's one thing I wanted to emphasize. The other thing I wanted to emphasize is, while there's what is known in the Russian language as победобесие, sort of victory frenzy was being cultivated in Putin's Russia, Somehow the rest of Europe did not pay attention to it, even though examples of that victory frenzy were being played out in capitals of European cities, in Berlin, in London, and elsewhere. We saw a celebration of violence, profound violence as well, including sexual violence that took place in all over Europe, perpetrated by the Red Army. Instead, the focus was on Russian victory on the Eastern Front, and you know, an equation of Soviet with Russian, which was extremely problematic. Now, so that's the question of instrumentalization, weaponization, I would say, and misinterpretation of history. What I do want to say, to talk about now, is the kind of things we can learn from the history of the Second World War, which might help us maybe understand some of the issues that we are confronted with today. There's quite a few things, but the one thing that worth remembering is that when it comes to the history of the Second World War on the territory of Ukraine, it's an extremely complex series of events. It's not something that started on the 1st of September and finished in May 1945. It's something that was experienced differently depending on the course of the war and differently in different parts of Ukraine. It's an extremely complex experience that the population of Ukraine went through, and to simplify it, it doesn't serve us. It doesn't serve us right. So one of the things that I'd like to point out is that a large percentage of the Ukrainian population hoped that was mobilized into the Red Army during the Second World War, hoped that the USSR would lose. Now that is something worth remembering. That, you know, these were when we talk about Ukrainians who were mobilized into the Red Army, even when we talk about Central and Eastern Ukraine, when we talk about 1941, when we talk about later periods when they had experienced German occupation in Reich Commissariat Ukraine, obviously the mood changed. But before, the memory of Holodomor, of famine, the memory of repressions, meant that these were highly unmotivated soldiers, right? They were hoping that the enemy would win. The other thing that I'd like to emphasize is the kind of lesson from the Second World War is so-called liberation. Liberation of Western Ukraine by the Red Army, by the USSR in 1939, essentially annexation of those territories. Those territories were annexed to the USSR. And this liberation was portrayed as, you know, we're going to come and rescue these extremely poor Ukrainians that used to live in Poland, and now they're going to join the wonderful Soviet Union. And when the Red Army arrived in Western Ukraine, they realized that these poor Ukrainians were actually much better off than the Red Army that arrived to rescue them. And so the liberators began to understand that it's actually them who needs to be liberated rather than those people they were supposedly liberating. And this feeling only got exacerbated through the course of the war, the further west the Red Army progressed. Now that is a very helpful thought for me today when I look at these troops, these Russian troops who perpetrated pillage, rape, loot in Ukraine, but who also, I mean, it's a pathetic sight when they get excited at the sight of a washing machine or a Nutella jar. You know, they've arrived to liberate Ukrainians, but actually they realize that, you know what, these Ukrainians live much better than we do. There's a beautiful quotation in Yaroslav Hrycak's recent book, where he quotes Stanislav, Ukrainian composer, who experienced the so-called liberation, annexation of Western Ukraine. And he said, I'm translating from Ukrainian, he said, we got liberated and we can do nothing about it. Like, and it can't be helped, you know? I mean, it would be funny if it wasn't so sad. The other thing that is related to this idea of the Red Army being in a terrible state and actually realizing that they are the ones that need rescuing is, well, how does an army run by the Kremlin operate? It is treated as cannon fodder. this is something worth remembering now with this new wave of mobilization. They are poorly armed, poorly trained. It doesn't matter. The Kremlin has never respected its soldiers, its population. It fought with bodies, not with technology, not with strategy, and so on. And that's a huge difference with Ukraine. And maybe our viewers have noticed when the Azovstal defenders, some of them, not very many, only over 200, were liberated were released in the prisoner of war swap, just how much joy there was in Ukrainian society at the sight of them being alive. And compare that with how much grief there was when Olena POW camp was attacked by the Russians, and prisoners of war were killed. There's a very different understanding of the value of human life. And there's certainly Ukrainian servicemen and women are certainly not being treated as cannon fodder in Ukraine, but I would say that the current move to mobilize so many untrained soldiers and just throw them at the front is an example of the same kind of culture of treating soldiers as, you know, as nothing, as disposable material in Russia. And also treating war crimes, perpetration of war crimes, as a perfectly acceptable way to conduct a war. We saw that in the Second World War, when the Red Army perpetrated countless war crimes, and we see it now in Ukraine. And it's something that we could have learned as a lesson, but maybe we failed to talk about it enough. And obviously I can keep going, but maybe I'll stop.
Thanks, Olesya. It is frightening sometimes, isn't it, how you see history repeating over and over again when it comes to, you know, what the armies do and what in particular the Russian army is doing at the moment. Can we move on then to a different topic, which also has already been mentioned, and that's the topic of Soviet legacies. You've referred to it, Olena, already. But it's a complex story, just as complex as the story of the war, which we've just heard Olesya try to summarize for us, to, you know, concisely in just a few minutes. So what about Sovietization? I mean, certainly different Ukrainian regions have been, you know, subjected to different policies. Soviet authorities have been, you know, involved in this process. Maybe for a different amount of time. Again, if we think about Western Ukraine, which was integrated or annexed, as Olesya just mentioned, only after the Second World War, as compared to, you know, the rest of Ukraine, where those policies have already been ongoing for a couple of decades. But as you showed, Olena, it's a more complex process because it's a process that involves a lot of local actors who have their own understanding what, you know, the Soviet rule, the Soviet regime, or the Soviet culture should be. So the question is, you know, how do you see it, first of all? And secondly, what should we do with all these complex Soviet legacies today? This is a very heated discussion, as I'm sure everybody in this you know, online room realizes. Olesya, tell us about it. Sorry, Olena.
Thank you. It's a very good question. I'll share a few thoughts, and then I would really appreciate if Stanislav could also join in with the perspective kind of from Ukraine itself, because same as Olesya, I'm in Western Europe, so I can speak about this based on my research, but it would be good also to hear some, so to say, local perspective to this. And indeed, the Ukrainian society is trying to come to terms with its Soviet past. And since 2015, there is a process, an ongoing process of desovietization, which was linked obviously to the Euromaidan. And there was like this process of Leninofall or Leninopad. And when a lot of Lenin monuments were finally being removed from public spaces everywhere in Ukraine. And a lot of streets and squares were renamed. And with the fully fledged invasion of Ukraine, which started in February 2024, we have this process accelerated. But now this process is being rebranded as derussification. So we can see a lot of voices from Ukrainian activists trying to push this so-called derussification or decolonization of public spaces even further, and basically remove all mentionings or all names to those people who were somehow involved in the Soviet past. And sometimes, as the case of Mikhail Bulgakov, also with the imperial past, right? But for me, as a historian of interwar Soviet Ukraine, this process is very, I see this process, I see a lot of danger in this process. And I can explain why. In April 2024, on this wave of derussification, the Kievans had the right to send their proposals for streets that needed to be renamed in Kiev, in the capital of Ukraine. And there were around 400 toponyms in Kiev proposed on the list, on this compiled list. And those streets and prospects and kind of avenues and squares to be renamed included names of such important cultural figures as Mykola Bazhan, Pavlo Tychina, Vasily Lanblakitny, Konstantin Dankevich, Ambrosy Buchma. I know our audience would not know these names, but these are the names of Soviet Ukrainian writers, actors, composers, theater directors who actually contributed to creating Ukrainian culture, although in this Soviet context, because this is what they had to deal with, right? When we think about the 1920s and 1930s. And when we try just to see the Soviet past in this black and white mode, it's, on the one hand, it's easier. Let's just delete everyone who had any connection to the Soviet past, and let's promote only those who had connection to the Ukrainian past. But the problem is, for me, as a historian of this period, is that by this, we are canceling very important initiatives of statehood, which were there in the 1920s. And actually, I even feel that such rash decision, we are just playing into Putin's hands. Why? Is because there is this continuous narrative of denied Ukrainian subjectivity, right? That Ukraine doesn't exist. This is just a battlefield between Russia and the West. So when we cancel this Soviet past, especially the 1920s, I mean, I'm kind of partial to this era, right? Olesya might speak more about the post-war period. But when we cancel this past, at the same time, we cancel this subjectivity that was being developing, right, at the time. It wasn't fully, Ukraine didn't gain this subjectivity, but at the same time, in the 1920s, we have the processes of standardizing Ukrainian language, of writing Ukrainian history narratives, of defining borders. And in all those processes, Ukrainian actors played a key role. They were on top of those Russian counterparts. We see when the borders were defined, and Ukrainians basically won in this debate with the Russians. When the borders were more beneficial to Ukrainian government rather than the Moscow government, and so on and so on. So, like, from my perspective, I think there is a need to tell the more complex history of the Soviet past, but at the same time to appropriate this past, just to deny this this Putin attempt of saying that Ukraine was created, that Ukraine never existed. Ukraine did exist. And this is, I think, is very important. And I would actually like to hear what Stanislav would say from the Ukrainian perspective, from Zaporizhzhia as well, how this process, what are the changes since 2014 and most recently since February in Zaporizhzhia?
Thank you. Thank you for the question. You know, Zaporizhzhia has unique historical experience from this point of view, because Zaporizhzhia was accepted like a city that was founded like an industrial center by the communistic regime. And of course, talking about this topic, I would like to say that we can examine it in terms of diversity and in terms of change. It's quite obvious. It's quite obvious that Soviet historian post-wars occupation past, and we have a lot of different ideological things and elements which are highly misleading. And to my mind, the things that we should definitely deny are the things that are strongly connected with the glorification of this Soviet propaganda. But we cannot skip the part of writing Ukrainian history of the 20th century Ukrainian history. Yeah? We can skip the part and deny the part of Golden Age myth. Yeah, so practically all myths about Golden Age are pretty much structurally the same. So you have a story about how everything was always static, never changed. To show history just like a clean unity in which everything which was polluting came from the outside. Yeah, and this is the way of rejecting historical diversity. It gets rid of origins, it gets rid of innovation, excludes origins and innovation. But Ukraine, rather than being a part of this myth of purity, Ukraine actually embodies in a very intense form most of the major themes of European history, world history, even being a part of Soviet history. It was, you know, one of the politicians mentioned, Ukrainian politicians, that practically political elites of Soviet Union were much more strongly connected with the Ukrainian political elites here. And to a certain extent, I think that we should preserve this historical objectivity, and at the same time, we should deny all the propaganda. It's quite uneasy, it's quite hard, it's quite difficult to do, but it seems to me that this is our task as historians, as researchers. This is our duty, and this is a part of functioning of a historian, like a professional in a whole.
Absolutely. Markian, would you allow me to make a very brief comment?
Yes, of course. Go ahead.
Actually, two brief comments related to this. First is when we talk about the territories that have been temporarily occupied now, what struck me was that the troops entering, that they had sort of two main figures. One was Pushkin, even though Pushkin in most cases had absolutely nothing to do with those territories that were being occupied, and somehow plastering advertising boards with some kind of quotations from Pushkin. But the other one was Lenin, and they kept putting these statues of Lenin back onto the squares which got rid of Lenins. And I just kept thinking to myself, where on earth do they get these Lenins from? And why does an invading army even have a statue of Lenin handy, you know, that they could just put on the square? That was fascinating. So it clearly shows you that, you know, the process of decommunization and de-Russification that happened in Russia is trying to be reversed. But I absolutely agree with both of you that it is our job to be vocal in society, in Ukrainian society, and explain, you know, explain each based on our own expertise where these things are going too far with, you know, with so-called canceling of certain figures or certain periods of Ukrainian, or perhaps maybe genuinely misunderstanding certain periods of Ukrainian history, where it's actually harmful to Ukrainian statehood. It's our job, and I'm not sure if we've done it all that well collectively as a community of historians, because we do sit in our ivory towers and we do talk to each other a lot, but not so much to the rest of society. And on that, I just want to bring it back to Western Europe, because that is also our job here, because we can complain all we want about people not understanding what Ukraine is and perceiving as some kind of post-Soviet blob. But when a student arrives at university and wants to choose a degree in the UK, there are only two places where they can study Ukraine, and that's UCL and CES and Cambridge. When they go to the library and they want to read about Ukraine, they are confronted with shelves and shelves and shelves and rows of literature on Russia and very little on Ukraine. And, you know, of course, Ukrainian historians and Ukraine specialists can't change that by themselves, but we need to continue to apply pressure on the management of our academic institutions to make sure that that provision is there, because we need to cultivate a new generation of experts on Ukraine, and we need to emphasize that that is a matter of security.
Yeah, really. It seems to me that the only thing that Russia recognizes and respects is the force and power. By the way, here in Ukraine, in our region, we had tremendous experience, with a tragic experience with our archives, libraries, with our publishing houses that were attacked, immensely attacked and destroyed. Even though in our information technology age, that makes no sense, because you can have a copy of the handbook on the Ukrainian history on the web, but they tried to destroy paper books physically. They think that this will destroy all the copies of these books somehow. The same is the case with the status of Lenin. I do remember the discussion with local people who told that we have to leave all the monuments on their place, because these monuments are the part of our history. But historians told in this public discussion, it was well organized by our authorities, that the monument is the place of glorification. It will never be the place of shame. For example, we know that we have a lot of tragedies which are closely connected with this person in our history. Then they said, well, we would just recollect in our memory only the right things, so that you will be able to explain, and that will be a good argument. But in fact, that was just an attempt to preserve different symbols of Soviet propaganda in our city. And luckily, we could skip that part, and we destroyed practically everything that was connected with the Soviet propaganda here.
Thank you, Stanislav. Well, our time is actually over, and as I think we've seen, there's a number of issues that require longer discussion, from the role of imperial agencies and agents, to the role of local actors, to memory politics, to all sorts of other issues that we might want to discuss on some other occasion. In particular, I think what I personally brought, from this discussion is that there is a need to talk more seriously about decolonizing East European history and East European studies by looking at precisely marginal voices, at different voices within Ukraine, within other borderlands of the Russian Empire and the Soviet Empire, as well as perhaps others. That might be one of the ways how we, as historians of Eastern Europe and of Ukraine more specifically, could contribute to this broader discussions. But, I'm sort of speaking ahead of myself. In fact, we are planning one of the events this year dedicated specifically to decolonizing East European history studies. So please do watch this space, and as I said before, watch the university website and social media for further announcements. Can I just finish by once again thanking all the three presenters for their very interesting and thought-provoking contributions.
Thank you, Markian. Thank you, colleagues.
Thank you, Markian. Thank you, colleagues. My pleasure.
Thank you. And well, that would be it then.